My name is Rachel Morgan, and by the time I turned 42, I had 7 children from 7 different fathers. If you had met me back then, you probably would have judged me too. Most people did. The cashiers at the grocery store looked at me differently. Mothers pulled their daughters closer when I walked past. Teachers spoke to me with that tone people use when they've already made up their minds about you. To the entire town, I was the woman who couldn't keep a man. The woman who kept having children with the wrong people. The woman everyone whispered about. What nobody knew was that every single one of those men had promised me forever. Every single one. And every single one left. 4 years I stopped trying to explain myself. I got tired of watching people pretend to listen while secretly blaming me. Then one afternoon, when my youngest son was 6 years old, a neighbor knocked on my door. She wasn't there to gossip. She wasn't there to criticize me. She wasn't there to ask for money or favors. She looked me straight in the eyes and asked a question nobody had ever asked before. Rachel, why did they all leave? I remember staring at her. Because after 20 years of rumors, she was the first person who wanted to hear the truth. And once I started talking, everything changed. I grew up believing in love. Not the fairy tale version. Not the movie version. Just the simple idea that if 2 people cared enough about each other, they would stay. My parents had been married for 48 years. They weren't perfect. They argued. They struggled. But they stayed. That was the example I carried into adulthood. I met the first father of my children when I was 19. His name was Eric. He was charming, funny, confident, and seemed completely fascinated by me. For the first time in my life I felt chosen. He brought flowers. He called every night. He talked about our future. Within a year I was pregnant. I thought he'd be excited. Instead I saw fear in his eyes. Not joy. Not pride. Fear. He promised he would stay. He promised we would figure everything out. Then one day he simply stopped answering my calls. First I thought something terrible had happened. Weeks passed. Then months. Eventually, I learned he'd moved to another state. Without saying goodbye. Without meeting his daughter. Without even sending a letter. I was devastated. But I convinced myself it was bad luck. One bad man didn't mean all men were bad. At least that's what I believed then. So I focused on raising my daughter. I worked 2 jobs. Barely slept. I learned how to stretch $10 into a week's worth of groceries. And somehow we survived. When my daughter was 4, I met another man. I told myself things would be different. I was older now. Wiser. More careful. His name was Daniel. He loved my daughter immediately. Or so it seemed. For 2 years he played the role of the perfect partner. Then I became pregnant again. And almost overnight everything changed. The affection disappeared. The patience vanished. The kindness faded. The man I thought I knew became someone else entirely. One night he looked at me and said something I'll never forget. I didn't sign up for this. I remember staring at him. 'Cause I thought we were building a family. Apparently he thought he was only dating me. 3 months later he was gone too. And just like that, I became a mother of 2 children with 2 absent fathers. By then people had started talking. The rumors began quietly. Then they spread. Soon everyone had an opinion. Most of them weren't kind. Some said I was desperate. Others said I had poor judgment. A few claimed I enjoyed being a victim. Nobody knew the reality. Nobody saw the nights I cried myself to sleep after the children were asleep. Nobody saw me sitting at the kitchen table wondering how I would pay rent. Nobody saw the panic attacks, the exhaustion, the loneliness. All they saw were the results. And people love judging results when they don't understand the story behind them. Yet somehow I still believed in love. I still believed the next person would be different. I had no idea how much pain that hope would eventually cost me. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if hope can become a trap. People always talk about hope as if it's something beautiful. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's the only thing keeping you alive. But sometimes hope convinces you to ignore warning signs because you're desperate to believe this time will be different. After Daniel left, I swore I would never let another man hurt me. Meant it. For nearly 3 years, I focused entirely on my children. My daughter was growing into a bright, thoughtful little girl. My son had inherited my father's stubbornness and endless curiosity. The three of us became our own little world. It wasn't easy. There were days when I had exactly $14 left in my bank account and another week before payday. There were nights when all three of us shared the same bed because I couldn't afford proper heating during the winter. But we survived. And for the first time in years, I started feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Then I met Michael. It happened at a community fundraiser. I wasn't looking for a relationship. In fact, I had spent years avoiding them. Michael was different from the men I had known before. At least that's what everyone told me. He was older, responsible, owned his own business, never missed church. Everyone respected him. Even my parents liked him immediately. That should have made me feel safe. Instead, something felt slightly off. Not enough to walk away. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. Whenever I talked about my dreams, he redirected the conversation back to himself. Whenever I made a decision, he questioned it. Whenever something good happened to me, he somehow found a way to minimize it. First, I dismissed it. Nobody is perfect. That became my favorite excuse. Nobody is perfect. Then I became pregnant again. The moment I told him, his expression changed. I had seen that look before. Not exactly the same, but close enough. Fear, panic, regret. The same emotions hiding behind different faces. For weeks he became distant, then colder, then angry. One evening he sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked a question that made my stomach drop. "Are you sure it's mine?" I remember feeling completely numb. Not because of the accusation, but because deep down I realized something. The relationship was already over. A man who loved you wouldn't ask that question after planning a future with you. Not unless he was already searching for an exit. 3 months later he found one. He packed his belongings while I was at work. When I came home he was gone. No note, no explanation, nothing. I sat on the living room floor and cried until sunrise. Not because Michael had left, but because I realized the pattern was happening again. And I couldn't understand why. I spent months blaming myself. Maybe I wasn't attractive enough. Maybe I wasn't smart enough. Maybe being a single mother made me impossible to love. Those thoughts poisoned me, little by little, day after day, until I started believing them. By the time my third child was born, my confidence had been completely shattered. Yet somehow life continued. Children don't stop needing their mother just because her heart is broken. So every morning I got up, made breakfast, packed lunches, worked long shifts, paid bills, helped with homework, read bedtime stories, and repeated the process the next day. Years passed. The children grew. And despite everything, they were happy. That became my greatest source of pride. People looked at my life and saw failure. I looked at my children and saw success. Then, when I was 32 years old, someone new entered my life. And this time, I truly believed fate was giving me one final chance. I had no idea I was about to experience the most painful betrayal of all. His name was Thomas Reed. I met him at the hospital. My youngest daughter had fallen from a playground slide and fractured her wrist. Nothing serious, thankfully. But I spent 6 hours sitting beside her bed while doctors ran tests and applied a cast. Thomas was there with his mother. She had undergone minor surgery and was recovering nearby. At some point during those long hours we started talking. First it was just small talk. Then stories. Then laughter. Real laughter. The kind I hadn't experienced in years. When my daughter finally fell asleep, Thomas brought me a cup of coffee from the hospital cafeteria. It wasn't much. But after everything I'd been through, that simple act felt incredibly kind. For the first time in a long while I felt seen. Not judged. Not pitied. Over the next several months, we kept running into each other. Sometimes at the grocery store. Sometimes at church. Sometimes at school events. Looking back, I realize he was intentionally creating those encounters. At the time I thought it was fate. I wanted to believe it was fate. Thomas knew my entire story before we ever started dating. He knew I had 3 children from 3 different fathers. He knew people talked about me. He knew the reputation I carried around town. And unlike everyone else, he never seemed bothered by it. People love simple explanations, he once told me. They'd rather judge than understand. Those words touched something deep inside me, because they were exactly what I needed to hear. The relationship moved slowly, much slower than my previous relationships, and I appreciated that. For nearly a year, Thomas never pressured me, never pushed, never rushed. He built trust one small piece at a time. My children adored him, especially my son. They spent entire weekends fishing together, fixing bicycles, building birdhouses, doing all the little things a boy hopes to do with a father figure. Sometimes I would watch them through the kitchen window and feel tears forming in my eyes. Not from sadness, from relief. Maybe this was finally the family I'd been praying for. Maybe all those years of heartbreak had led me here. Maybe this was the reason I never gave up. When Thomas proposed, I said yes before he even finished asking. The children cheered. My parents cried. Even people in town seemed happy for us. For once, nobody was whispering. Nobody was gossiping. Nobody was waiting for disaster. For the first time in my adult life, everything felt right. Then I became pregnant again. And slowly, almost invisibly, things began changing. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Just little things. Tiny cracks appearing where there had once been trust. Thomas became more controlling. First it sounded like concern. Maybe you shouldn't work so many hours. You seem tired. Let me handle the finances. You don't need that friend anymore. You should spend more time at home. Individually, each comment sounded harmless. Together they formed a cage. And I didn't notice it until the cage was already built. Within a year, Thomas controlled nearly every aspect of my life. The money, the schedules, the decisions, even my friendships. One evening, my oldest daughter pulled me aside. She was 13 at the time, old enough to notice things adults sometimes miss. "Mom," she whispered, "why are you always apologizing to him?" The question hit me like a punch. Because I didn't have an answer. I hadn't realized how often I was apologizing. For dinner being late. For spending money. For being tired. For disagreeing. For existing. Little by little, Thomas had convinced me that every problem in our relationship was somehow my fault. The same thing had happened before. Different man. Different methods. Same result. But this time there were 4 children involved. And another baby on the way. Leaving felt impossible. So I stayed. And things got worse. Not physically. Thomas never hit me. In some ways that made it harder to recognize what was happening. His weapons were guilt. Manipulation. Control. Isolation. Every conversation somehow became my fault. Every disagreement became proof that I was unreasonable. Every concern became evidence that I was unstable. Eventually I stopped trusting my own judgment. And that was exactly what he wanted. Then one night something happened that changed everything. Something that forced me to see the truth. And once I saw it, I could never unsee it. It happened on a Tuesday night. Nothing dramatic. No screaming. No shattered glass. No police cars. Just a single sentence. A single sentence spoken by my oldest daughter. The kind of sentence that changes your life forever. We were cleaning up after dinner. Thomas had spent the entire evening criticizing everyone. The potatoes were too salty. The children were too loud. The house wasn't clean enough. I wasn't paying enough attention to him. By then, those comments had become normal. At least to me. But not to my daughter. She had spent years watching everything. Quietly. Carefully. And that night, after Thomas left the room, she looked at me and said, "Mom, why do all the men you love end up making you sad?" The room became silent. I remember gripping the kitchen counter, unable to speak. Because children have a way of seeing truths adults spend years avoiding. She wasn't asking to be cruel. She wasn't judging me. She genuinely wanted to understand. And for the first time I asked myself the same question. Why? Why did every relationship eventually become painful? Why did every man start out loving and end up leaving or controlling me? Why did the same story keep repeating? That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the living room until sunrise, thinking, remembering, replaying decades of memories. And for the first time I stopped focusing on the men. Instead I focused on myself. Not to blame myself. To understand myself. The answer didn't come immediately. It arrived slowly, painfully, piece by piece. And once I saw it, I felt both devastated and relieved. Because for the first time in 20 years, the pattern finally made sense. Every man had been different. Different personalities. Different jobs. Different backgrounds. Different families. Yet they all had one thing in common. Me. That realization terrified me. At first I thought it meant everyone else had been right. Maybe I really was the problem. Maybe the town had been correct all along. But the more I reflected, the more I understood something important. I wasn't attracting bad men because I was bad. I was attracting them because I had never learned how to protect myself from them. There was a difference. Huge difference. For weeks, I dug through old memories. And eventually my thoughts led me back to my childhood. Back to things I had spent years ignoring. My father was a hardworking man. A respected man. A loyal provider. People admired him. So did I. But my father had one flaw. One enormous flaw. He controlled everything. Every decision. Every dollar. Every conversation. Every opinion. Growing up, I learned that love meant obedience. Love meant keeping the peace. Love meant sacrificing your needs for someone else's comfort. If someone was upset with me, I immediately assumed I had done something wrong. If someone criticized me, I automatically believed them. If someone demanded more from me, I gave more. And more. And more. Until there was nothing left. I had spent my entire life trying to earn love. Not receive it. Earn it. That realization broke something inside me. Because suddenly every relationship made sense. Eric left because responsibility scared him. Daniel left because family wasn't what he wanted. Michael left because commitment threatened his freedom. Thomas stayed longer because controlling me benefited him. Different men. Different reasons. But I had ignored warning signs every single time. Not because I was foolish. Because I was desperate to be loved. Desperate people accept things healthy people would never tolerate. And that truth hurt. It hurt more than every breakup. More than every abandonment. More than every rumor. Because it forced me to confront something I had spent years avoiding. I didn't know what healthy love looked like. I only knew how to give. I didn't know how to receive. A week later, I made a decision that terrified me. I started therapy. The first session was awful. I cried almost the entire time. The second session wasn't much better. Neither was the third. But little by little, things started changing. For the first time in my life, someone wasn't telling me what I should do. Someone was helping me understand why I did it. And the deeper we went, the more clearly I saw the truth. The men who left had caused enormous pain. But the wounds that made me vulnerable to them were much older. Much deeper. And healing them would take years. What I didn't know was that my decision to start healing myself was about to create a conflict that Thomas never saw coming. 'Cause the moment I started changing, he started losing control. And he hated that more than anything. At first, Thomas didn't notice the changes. They were small. So small that even I barely recognized them. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I stopped asking permission before making simple decisions. I stopped explaining myself every time I disagreed with him. They seemed like tiny adjustments. But to someone who thrives on control, tiny adjustments feel like rebellion. The first time he noticed was over something ridiculous. Toaster. Our old toaster had finally broken after years of use. While running errands, I bought a new one. Nothing expensive. Just a basic model on sale. When I brought it home, Thomas stared at it. "Who said you could buy that?" The old version of me would have immediately apologized. I would have explained the sale, explained the necessity, explained the budget, explained everything. Instead, I simply answered. The old one stopped working. The silence that followed felt strange, almost uncomfortable, because for the first time I wasn't defending myself. I was simply stating a fact. His face tightened. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. And for the first time I noticed something else. He wasn't upset about the toaster. He was upset because he hadn't made the decision. That realization stayed with me. Over the next few months, I began seeing dozens of similar moments. Moments I would have ignored before. Moments that suddenly looked very different. If I spent time with friends, he became cold. If I disagreed with him, he became distant. If I succeeded at something, he found a way to criticize it. Everything had to orbit around him. Everything. The more confidence I gained through therapy, the more obvious it became. And the more obvious it became, the harder it was to pretend everything was normal. One evening, my therapist asked me a question. Simple question. "Rachel, if one of your daughters described this relationship to you, what advice would you give her?" I immediately answered. "I'd tell her to leave." The words came out before I could stop them. Then I started crying, because for the first time I realized how differently I treated myself. I wanted my daughters to have healthy relationships. I wanted them to feel respected, valued. Yet I wasn't demanding those same things for myself. Why? The answer was painful. Because somewhere deep inside, I still believed I had to earn love. That belief had followed me my entire life. And now it was standing between me and freedom. A few weeks later, something happened that removed all doubt. My oldest daughter had been accepted into an advanced academic program. She worked incredibly hard for it. For months, the entire family gathered around the dinner table to celebrate. My daughter was glowing with pride. I was glowing with pride. Then Thomas spoke. "Don't get too excited." The room became quiet. My daughter looked confused. "What do you mean?" I shrugged. "It doesn't guarantee anything. Plenty of smart people end up nowhere." I watched the joy disappear from her face. Just like that. In seconds. And suddenly I saw something I had never fully understood before. Thomas wasn't just hurting me. He was hurting my children. The same way he hurt me. The same way he diminished me. The same way he controlled me. My daughter sat silently for the rest of dinner. That night, I found her crying in her room. I thought he'd be proud of me. That sentence shattered my heart. Because I knew exactly how she felt. I'd spent years hoping Thomas would be proud of me too. Years chasing approval that never came. And now my daughter was beginning the same cycle. Well, I couldn't allow that. I wouldn't allow that. For the first time in years, something stronger than fear appeared inside me. Anger. Not explosive anger. Protective anger. The kind that appears when someone threatens your children. The kind that reminds you what matters most. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen. The same kitchen where I'd cried after Eric left. The same kitchen where Daniel's abandonment had broken me. The same kitchen where Michael's betrayal had crushed my confidence. But this time felt different. For the first time, I wasn't asking why men kept leaving. I wasn't asking what was wrong with me. I wasn't asking how to save the relationship. I was asking something else. Why was I still staying? The answer terrified me. Because I realized there was no good reason. Only fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of starting over. Fear of judgment. Fear of failure. But after everything I'd survived, those fears suddenly looked smaller than they used to. And for the first time in 20 years, I began imagining a future without Thomas. A future where nobody controlled me. A future where my children didn't have to walk on eggshells. A future where peace was possible. What I didn't know was that Thomas had already sensed the shift. He knew something was changing. He knew he was losing control. And soon, He would make a mistake so revealing that even the children would finally see who he really was. The mistake happened 3 months later. And it happened in front of everyone, including the children. By then I had stopped arguing with Thomas. Not because things were better. Because I was observing, listening, paying attention. For years, I had been too busy defending myself to notice who he really was. Now I was finally seeing him clearly. The children were seeing him too. Especially the older ones. One Saturday afternoon, my son Caleb came home excited. He was 16 and had just been offered a part-time job at a local hardware store. It wasn't a huge opportunity, but to him it meant everything. His first paycheck. His first responsibility. His first taste of independence. He walked through the front door smiling. The kind of smile only a teenager can have when he feels proud of himself. "Mom, I got the job." I immediately hugged him. The younger children started cheering. Everyone was excited. Everyone except Thomas. He barely looked up from his chair. "What about school?" Caleb blinked. "My grades are good." "What about sports?" "I can do both." Thomas shook his head. "You'll probably quit after a month anyway." The room instantly went silent. I watched the smile disappear from Caleb's face. Exactly the same way my daughter's smile had disappeared months earlier. Exactly the same way mine had disappeared hundreds of times over the years. And suddenly something remarkable happened. My son spoke. Not angrily. Not disrespectfully. Just honestly. "Why do you always do that?" Thomas frowned. "Do what?" Caleb looked directly at him. "Why do you always ruin things when people are happy?" The silence that followed felt enormous. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Thomas stared at him. My son stared back. For the first time, someone in the house had said out loud what everyone had been thinking. And once the truth is spoken, it becomes very difficult to bury again. Thomas stood up, his face turning red. "Watch your tone. I'm just asking. You don't know what you're talking about." Caleb didn't respond. He simply walked upstairs. The conversation ended there. But something important had changed. The children weren't afraid anymore. They were beginning to trust their own eyes. And once that happens, manipulation starts losing its power. That night, Thomas exploded. Not publicly, privately. The moment the children went to bed, he confronted me. "What are you telling them about me?" I stared at him. "Nothing." "Then why are they acting like this?" "Because they're growing up. Because they're paying attention. Because they're seeing what I've finally started seeing." But I didn't say any of that. I simply repeated the truth. "I'm not telling them anything." He paced around the kitchen, angrier than I'd ever seen him. Not because of Caleb. Because control was slipping away. And he knew it. Then he said something that changed everything. Something he could never take back. "If it weren't for me, nobody would want a woman like you." The words landed like a slap. For a moment, the room felt completely still. Years earlier, those words would have destroyed me. Years earlier, I would have believed them. But something inside me had changed. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time I saw desperation. Not strength. Not authority. Desperation. Because people who feel secure don't need to convince others they're worthless. Only insecure people do that. Only frightened people. Only people terrified of being abandoned themselves. And suddenly I understood. Thomas needed me to feel broken. Because if I ever realized my worth, I would leave. The realization was so clear it almost made me laugh. For years, I'd thought he was stronger than me. In reality, he was terrified. Terrified that one day I would stop believing his version of me. And that day had finally arrived. The next morning I called my therapist. Then I called a lawyer. Not because I had already made a final decision. 'Cause I needed information. For once, I wasn't acting from fear. I was acting from clarity. And clarity is dangerous to people who depend on confusion. Over the next several weeks, I quietly prepared. I reviewed finances, gathered documents, made plans. created options. The entire time, Thomas remained unaware. He knew something was changing, but he didn't realize how far the change had already gone. Then one evening, while cleaning the garage, my oldest daughter discovered something unexpected. Box, hidden behind old storage containers. Inside that box were documents that would reveal a secret Thomas had spent years concealing. A secret that would finally convince me there was no future left to save. The box was covered in dust. At first, my daughter almost threw it away. It looked like nothing more than an old storage container buried behind holiday decorations and broken tools. But when she lifted it, she noticed it was heavier than it should have been. "Mom!" she called from the garage. I walked in expecting to help move furniture. Instead, I found her kneeling beside the box. "What is it?" I shrugged. "No idea." Opened it. Inside were folders. Dozens of them. Neatly organized. Labeled by year. First, I assumed they were business records. Thomas was always saving paperwork. But then I saw my name. My stomach tightened. I pulled out the first folder. Inside were copies of financial statements, bank accounts, credit cards, insurance policies, loan applications. Some of them included my signature. Others did not. I frowned, because I didn't remember signing several of those documents. My daughter noticed my expression. "What's wrong?" I forced a smile. "Nothing. Go help your brothers." The moment she left, I continued looking. And the deeper I dug, the worse it became. Over the next hour, I discovered things I never knew existed. Accounts I had never seen. Debts I didn't recognize. Financial decisions made entirely without my knowledge. My hands were shaking. Not because of the money. Because of what it represented. For years, Thomas had insisted on handling everything. Every bill. Every account. Every financial decision. And because I trusted him, I let him. Now I was realizing just how much power I had handed over. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I spread the documents across the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where I had spent years questioning myself. The same table where I had cried over failed relationships. The same table where I had finally begun rebuilding my confidence. By sunrise, one thing had become painfully clear. Thomas had been lying to me for years. Not about one thing. About dozens of things. The next morning, I quietly met with the lawyer again. This time I brought copies. I watched his expression change as he reviewed them. Then he removed his glasses, looked directly at me, and asked a question. "Rachel, how much of this did you know?" The answer was simple. "None of it." He leaned back in his chair, silent for several seconds. Then he sighed. "You need to prepare yourself." My heart started pounding. "For what?" "Because I think this situation is much bigger than you realize." Those words echoed in my head all afternoon. Much bigger than you realize. I had spent years believing my biggest problem was abandonment. Then I thought my biggest problem was low self-esteem. Then I thought my biggest problem was Thomas. Now I wasn't sure what the problem was anymore. All I knew was that the truth kept getting larger. And more disturbing. Over the following weeks, more information emerged. Piece by piece. Like a puzzle finally revealing its picture. Some of the accounts contained money I knew nothing about. Others contained debts connected to business ventures Thomas had hidden. There were investments, withdrawals, transactions that made no sense. And the more questions I asked, the more defensive he became. That alone told me everything. Honest people answer questions. Dishonest people attack the person asking them. One evening I confronted him. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. I simply placed the documents on the dining table. His face turned pale. Just for a second. But I saw it. The reaction disappeared almost instantly. Yet it was enough. Because innocent people don't react that way. "What is this?" he asked. He barely glanced at the papers. Business records. Why was my name on some of them? His jaw tightened. "You wouldn't understand." That answer might have worked years earlier. Not anymore. I folded my arms. Try me. The argument lasted nearly 2 hours. And during those 2 hours, something extraordinary happened. For the first time, Thomas stopped pretending. The mask slipped. The charm disappeared. The carefully controlled image collapsed. And underneath it all was a man furious that his secrets had been discovered. A man who genuinely believed he was entitled to make decisions for everyone else. A man who saw honesty as a threat. When the argument finally ended, he stormed out of the house, slamming the front door so hard the walls shook. The younger children were frightened. The older children weren't. They looked relieved. And that realization broke my heart. Because no child should feel relieved when an adult leaves the house. That night, my oldest daughter sat beside me on the couch. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she quietly asked, "Mom." "Yes. Are you finally going to leave him?" I stared at her. Because she hadn't asked if I was okay. She hadn't asked what happened. She hadn't asked who was right. She already knew. All the children knew. They had known for years. And suddenly I realized something devastating. I wasn't the last person to see the truth. I was the last person to admit it. The next morning I made the hardest decision of my life. Not because I wasn't sure. 'Cause I was. For the first time in decades I was completely sure. Called the lawyer. And I told him to begin the process. Thomas didn't know it yet. But the chapter that had controlled nearly a decade of my life was finally coming to an end. What happened next would shock the entire town. Because the same people who had spent years judging me were about to learn a truth none of them expected. News travels fast in a small town. Faster than truth. Faster than facts. Faster than almost anything. By the time Thomas learned I had officially filed the paperwork, half the town already knew. By the end of the week, everyone knew. The rumors returned immediately. Some people said I was leaving him for another man. Others claimed I had become selfish. A few suggested I was destroying my family because therapy had changed me. I wasn't surprised. People tend to resist explanations that force them to reconsider years of assumptions. For 2 decades they had built a story about me. Rachel, the woman who couldn't keep a man. Rachel, the woman with 7 children from 7 fathers. Rachel, the woman who made bad choices. That story was comfortable. Simple. Easy. The truth was much more complicated. And complicated truths make people uncomfortable. First, I ignored the gossip. I had bigger things to worry about. The children. The legal process. The finances. Our future. But then something unexpected happened. The children started speaking up. Not publicly. Not online. Not dramatically. Just honestly. One afternoon my son Caleb came home from school angry. Usually he was calm. That day he wasn't. "What happened?" I asked. He dropped his backpack onto the floor. "Someone said you ruin every relationship you're in." My stomach tightened. "What did you say?" He looked directly at me. "I told them they don't know anything." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he continued. "They think they know our family because they hear rumors." I felt tears forming. Because for years I had tried protecting the children from judgment. I hadn't realized they were protecting me too. A few days later, something similar happened with my oldest daughter. A woman at church made a comment about poor life choices. My daughter politely responded, "Sometimes surviving isn't a poor choice." The woman apparently had no response. Neither did I when my daughter told me. 'Cause she was right. People love judging decisions made under circumstances they've never experienced. They judge from comfort, from distance, from safety. They rarely imagine what they would actually do in the same situation. Meanwhile, the legal process continued. And the more information emerged, the clearer things became. The lawyer eventually uncovered details that explained many of the financial mysteries. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic enough for television. Just years of deception. Years of hidden decisions. Years of control disguised as responsibility. And when the evidence was organized, A pattern emerged. The same pattern I had finally recognized in our relationship. Thomas never wanted a partner. He wanted authority. The difference mattered. Partner respects your voice. Authority replaces it. Partner shares power. Authority collects it. Partner helps you grow. Authority needs you dependent. Once I understood that distinction, everything made sense. Not just Thomas. My entire adult life. 4 years I had mistaken control for security. Control feels safe when you've spent your life afraid. Someone making decisions for you can look like protection. Until you realize you've disappeared in the process. One evening, while sorting through old photographs, I found pictures from every major chapter of my life. There I was with Eric, young, hopeful, Eve, then Daniel, then Michael, then Thomas. Different faces, different years, different stories. Yet something about the photographs shocked me. Not the men. Me. In every picture I look smaller. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone constantly trying to earn approval. Constantly trying to become what someone else wanted. Constantly afraid of losing love. I stared at those photographs for nearly an hour. Then I found a recent family picture. One taken only a few weeks earlier. I almost didn't recognize myself. For the first time I looked confident. Tired certainly. Life with 7 children guaranteed that. But confident. Present. Alive. And suddenly I realized something important. The woman everyone judged no longer existed. The woman who needed constant validation. The woman who accepted crumbs and called them love. The woman who confused sacrifice with self-destruction. She was disappearing. Slowly. But she was disappearing. That realization felt like freedom. Not complete freedom. But the beginning of it. Then, about 2 months later, the neighbor who had started everything knocked on my door again. The same woman who had asked a simple question. Why did they all leave? This time she brought 2 cups of coffee. We sat on the front porch, watching the sunset, talking quietly. Eventually she smiled. You know, Rachel. What? I don't think they left because of you. I laughed softly. A year earlier, hearing those words would have felt life-changing. Now they felt different. Because I no longer needed someone else to tell me. Already knew. And for the first time in my life I believed it. Still, what happened next would be even more powerful. Because the biggest lesson wasn't about the men who left. It was about the 7 children who stayed. And what they would eventually teach me about love, forgiveness, and family. People often assume the greatest achievement of my life was raising 7 children alone. It wasn't. The greatest achievement was raising 7 children who still believed in love. After everything they had witnessed. After every disappointment. After every broken promise. After every goodbye. They still believed people could be good. That amazed me. Because there were years when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The divorce process took nearly a year to finalize. It wasn't pleasant. Most divorces aren't. But compared to the emotional battles I'd already survived, the legal process felt manageable. By then, something inside me had fundamentally changed. I no longer measured my worth through someone else's approval. I no longer felt responsible for fixing people. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer feared being alone. That last one surprised me. For most of my adult life, loneliness had terrified me. It had driven countless decisions. Poor decisions. Desperate decisions. Fear-based decisions. Then one morning, while drinking coffee alone in my kitchen, I realized something. I wasn't lonely. I was peaceful. There is a huge difference. Loneliness feels like something is missing. Peace feels like nothing needs to be added. For the first time in decades, I experienced that feeling regularly. The children noticed too. The house felt different. Lighter. Calmer. Safer. There were no more emotional landmines. No more walking on eggshells. No more trying to predict someone else's moods. The tension that had quietly lived inside our walls for years simply disappeared. One evening, my youngest son made an observation that nearly brought me to tears. He was sitting at the dinner table, now 10 years old enough to notice changes, young enough to speak honestly, Mom. Yes. Our house feels happy now. The room became quiet. Not sad. Just quiet. Because every one of us understood exactly what he meant. The older children exchanged glances. Then smiled. And for the first time I realized something. Healing doesn't only happen to individuals. Families heal too. Slowly. Patiently. One conversation at a time. One safe day at a time. One peaceful dinner at a time. Months turned into years. The children continued growing. My oldest daughter graduated high school with honors. Then college. The same daughter who once asked why every man I loved made me sad. Watching her walk across that graduation stage remains one of the proudest moments of my life. Not because of the degree. Because she had grown into a woman who understood her worth. A woman who never accepted relationships that required her to shrink herself. She had learned what took me 40 years to understand. My son Caleb eventually opened his own business. The hardware store job he was once discouraged from taking became the first step toward a successful career. My younger children found their own paths as well. Different dreams. Different personalities. Different futures. Yet they all carried something I desperately hoped to give them. Self-respect. Looking back, I think that's what I wanted most. Not wealth. Not status. Not perfection. Just self-respect. Because people with self-respect recognize warning signs earlier. They set boundaries faster. They recover from setbacks more effectively. And they don't spend years trying to convince someone to love them. Then, one day, something happened that I never expected. One of the fathers reached out. Not Thomas. Not Michael. Eric. First one. The man who had disappeared before meeting his daughter. 23 years had passed. 23 years. When his letter arrived, I stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it. Part of me wanted to throw it away. Part of me wanted answers. Eventually curiosity won. Inside was a handwritten apology. Several pages long. No excuses. No blame. No manipulation. Just regret. Regret for the years he missed. Regret for the daughter he never knew. Regret for choices he could never undo. When I finished reading, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Sadness. Because some losses cannot be repaired. Only acknowledged. I showed the letter to my daughter. Then I told her the decision was hers. Not mine. She thought about it for weeks. Then she agreed to meet him. I wasn't present during that meeting. Nor should I have been. That relationship belonged to them. Not me. When she returned home afterward, she sat quietly for a long time. Finally she spoke. He's just a man. He nodded. Because that's exactly what he was. 4 years, he'd existed in our minds as a wound. Mystery. A ghost. Now he was simply a man. Flawed. Human. Imperfect. And strangely, that reality brought healing. Not reconciliation. Not restoration. Healing. Sometimes healing doesn't come from getting what you lost. Sometimes it comes from finally seeing things clearly. As the years passed, I found myself thinking less about the men who left. Less about betrayal. Less about abandonment. More about gratitude. Gratitude for the children. Gratitude for survival. Gratitude for lessons I never wanted but desperately needed. Then, during a neighborhood gathering, someone asked me a question I hadn't heard in years. A question that instantly transported me back to the day my neighbor first knocked on my door. The question was simple. Rachel, how did you do it? And for the first time I knew exactly how to answer. For a moment I simply smiled. The woman asking the question was young. Maybe 30. Married. 2 small children. The kind of exhaustion every parent recognizes immediately. She wasn't being rude. She genuinely wanted to know. How did you do it? How did you raise 7 children mostly alone? How did you survive all those years? How did you keep going? The neighborhood gathering buzzed around us. Children played nearby. People laughed. Music drifted through the evening air. And suddenly I realized something. For most of my life, I would have answered that question incorrectly. I would have talked about strength, determination, Sacrifice, hard work, all of those things mattered. But they weren't the real answer. The truth, said. She nodded. I stopped waiting for someone to save me. The woman looked surprised. So I continued. For years, I thought happiness would arrive with the right relationship. She listened carefully. I thought the right man would finally fix everything. And I smiled softly. And life doesn't work that way. She was silent, waiting. So I told her the lesson that had taken me decades to learn. No relationship can give you something you refuse to give yourself. Respect, security, trust, self-worth. Those things have to begin inside you. Otherwise you'll spend your entire life looking for them in people who can't provide them. Or worse, people who know exactly how to exploit that need. The young mother sat quietly, thinking. And I realized I wasn't really speaking to her. I was speaking to the younger version of myself. The 19-year-old girl who thought love meant never being left. The 23-year-old woman crying over Daniel. The 28-year-old trying to understand Michael. The 35-year-old trapped with Thomas. I wished I could go back and tell her everything. But life doesn't allow that. Instead, we pass the lessons forward. That's all any of us can do. As the evening continued, several of my children joined us. Adults now. Not children anymore. Watching them together always filled me with gratitude. Because every single one of them had become stronger than the circumstances they were born into. That wasn't an accident. They had worked for it, fought for it, earned it. And then something happened that I will never forget. My oldest daughter stood up and tapped her glass. The room gradually quieted. People turned toward her. She smiled. I want to say something. Immediately I became nervous. She laughed. Relax, Mom. Everyone chuckled. Then her expression softened. And she began speaking. When I was younger, people used to feel sorry for us. The room became silent. People assumed our family was broken. She looked around. They saw 7 children with 7 different fathers. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Because everyone knew it was true. The town had talked about us for years. Then she continued. But what they didn't see was our mother. I felt my throat tighten. She worked when she was exhausted. My daughter looked at me. She gave when she had almost nothing left. My vision started blurring. She protected us when nobody protected her. The silence deepened. Several people wiped their eyes, including me. Then my daughter smiled. And the reason all 7 of us are here today isn't because life was easy. He paused. It's because she never quit. By then I was crying openly. Not elegant tears. Real tears. The kind that arrive after years of carrying burdens nobody sees. One by one, my other children stood beside her. 7 children. 7 different stories. 7 different personalities. One family. And suddenly I understood something that had taken me decades to recognize. The measure of a life isn't who leaves. It's who remains. For years I had focused on abandonment. The fathers who disappeared. The relationships that failed. The promises that broke. But standing there, surrounded by my children, I finally saw the bigger picture. 7 people stayed. 7 people loved me. 7 people grew beside me. 7 people built a family together. And somehow, despite every obstacle, that family had become something beautiful. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch. The same porch where my neighbor had asked me the question years earlier. Why did they all leave? The answer no longer mattered. Not really. Because the more important question was never why they left. The more important question was why we survived. And the answer was simple. Love. Not romantic love. Not the fragile kind dependent on promises. The stronger kind. The kind that stays. The kind that endures. The kind that grows through hardship. The kind that survives disappointment. The kind that keeps showing up. I looked through the window at my children laughing inside. And for the first time in my life, I understood something completely. I was never abandoned. Not truly. Because everything I thought I had lost had eventually led me to what mattered most. The family we built together. And that family was worth every difficult mile of the journey.